The bustling New Hope Central restaurant hummed with 1,000 conversations, but in a quiet corner, an old veteran sat alone. His presence was easily lost in the cheerful clamor, yet a faded tattoo on his arm hinted at stories untold, battles fought, and a life far richer than his humble appearance suggested. It was Sunday morning, and New Hope Central restaurant was packed, buzzing with the usual brunch crowd and the special energy of Veterans Discount Day. In a sunlit corner, a thin man in his early 70s, Johnny Dawson, sat quietly. He wore a simple, worn jacket, his white hair a testament to years, and behind his old spectacles, his eyes held a distant, contemplative gaze. His left arm, resting on the table beside a glass of water, bore a faded tattoo, a dagger piercing a compass. He just nursed his drink, waiting. At a nearby table, four boisterous middle-aged men, dressed in crisp polo shirts and loafers, were laughing loudly, their voices carrying across the room. One, with a booming laugh and an expensive watch, gestured subtly towards Johnny. "I bet that tattoo's something he just drew on himself," he chuckled to his friends. "Looks ancient, what kind of soldier doesn't even have a veteran's card?" Their snickers followed. A young waitress, new to the restaurant, approached Johnny's table, her face a mix of embarrassment and practiced politeness. "I'm so sorry, sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "but someone complained that you're making other guests uncomfortable. Would you mind sitting in the outdoor area, please?" Johnny's gaze remained steady. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a quiet acceptance that spoke volumes. Slowly, deliberately, he picked up his small tray of food and, gripping his worn cane with his left hand, began to push himself up. Each movement was a struggle, his right hand carefully balancing the tray as he limped towards the door. The sound of his worn shoes, combined with the slight dragging of his bad leg, seemed to echo in the brief lull of conversations around him. A child, waiting in line with his father, tugged on his dad's shirt. "Dad, why does that man walk so strangely?" The father, without missing a beat, pulled the child closer, his whisper loud enough to reach Johnny. "Just a homeless person, son. Don't pay him any mind." As Johnny passed the table of the four laughing men, the one who'd scoffed at his tattoo deliberately raised his voice. "If he's really a Special Forces operative," he sneered, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear, "then I must be the Supreme Commander." Their table erupted in a fresh wave of booming laughter, a cruel chorus that filled the air. Johnny didn't react, his face a mask of quiet endurance. Only a single, silent tear betrayed his composure, tracing a path down his weathered cheek before falling, unnoticed, onto the tiled floor. No one stopped him. No one asked. The manager, observing the scene from behind the counter, hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, but then turned away to help another customer. Johnny's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly as he reached the heavy glass door, pushing it open with his shoulder, a fragile balancing act of tray, cane, and dignity. The sunlight outside was unexpectedly harsh, forcing Johnny to squint as he scanned the almost empty outdoor seating area. Perhaps this was precisely why they'd wanted him out here, out of sight, where his quiet presence wouldn't disturb the more respectable patrons inside. Each step was a small, arduous battle. His old leg, which had carried him through decades of silent service, creaked faintly with every shift of weight, a constant reminder of the maintenance it needed but that he couldn't afford. His meager veteran's pension barely covered his tiny apartment's rent and the ever-growing stack of medications. He found a small, wobbly metal table near the patio's edge and carefully set down his tray. The simple Veterans Day special, scrambled eggs and toast, was already growing cold. It was a meal he'd saved up for, a small personal ritual to honor a promise made long ago. Through the window, he watched the vibrant tableau inside, people laughing, sharing stories, clinking glasses. Out here, it was just him and the occasional passing car, the distant murmur of traffic his only company. This separation, this invisible wall between him and a world that couldn't see beyond his worn exterior, wasn't new. He remembered a time, decades ago, when he was one of the invisible men, those who operated in the shadows. He was John Dawson, a gifted navigation specialist in the Marine Corps' highly classified Shadow Ops Special Unit. Back in 1972, during a top-secret infiltration mission deep within hostile territory, his team had triggered a cleverly laid decoy trap. The blast had torn through his leg, leaving him with permanent damage. There was no fanfare when he returned home, no public commendations or parades. Many of his missions remained classified, buried under layers of national security. He lived a quiet life, opening a small map-making company in a secluded Colorado town, relying on his meticulous precision and unparalleled sense of direction to create bespoke maps for local explorers and surveyors. He rarely spoke of his military past, preferring the quiet hum of his plotting machine to the clamor of recognition. All he carried from that life were the faded tattoo on his wrist and a single, yellowed letter, a handwritten note from his former commanding officer. To the most silent guide I have ever commanded, it read, "Your direction always brought us home." Every year, on Veterans Day, he visited a different restaurant. Not for the discount, but to honor the memory of a friend who had fallen with him during that very explosion, a man who loved this restaurant's burgers. Yet, almost every year, he was misunderstood, judged, and dismissed like an old beggar. Johnny never complained. He never corrected anyone. The soft-spoken cartographer simply moved on, carrying the heavy weight of memories that few would ever comprehend. His neighbors knew him simply as Old Rob, a kind-hearted man who fixed their kids' bikes for free and never missed a morning greeting. What they didn't know was that the limp in his step came from guiding 3 men to safety through a treacherous ambush, or that the faint scars on his hands were from meticulously clearing a path through a minefield under fire. This restaurant, New Hope Central, held a special significance. It was the place his fallen friend, James, had promised they would eat at when they finally returned home, a promise made the night before their final mission together. Johnny blinked, a sudden sharp pain in his chest that had nothing to do with his physical leg. He just sat there, alone, his food cooling, the invisible wall between him and the bustling life inside thickening with every passing moment. Inside the restaurant, a young waitress, the one who had felt a pang of unease as Johnny was escorted outside, continued her shift. Her name was Sarah Harrington. She'd only been working here for 2 weeks, fresh out of community college, but something about the old man's dignified silence, despite the obvious humiliation, had struck her. There was a quiet strength about him, buried deep beneath the years of neglect and dismissal, that she couldn't quite shake. She watched him through the window as he slowly, methodically ate his cold breakfast, a solitary figure against the backdrop of an empty patio. Johnny continued to eat, his mind drifting back to 1972. He remembered James Harrington, his closest friend in the unit, carrying a crumpled photograph of this very restaurant in his pocket. "Best burgers in New Hope, Johnny," James used to say with a wide grin. "When we get home, I'm buying the first round." They were just 8 miles from the extraction point, deep in enemy territory, when they hit the decoy trap. Johnny had been navigating, relying on hand-drawn maps and his uncanny memory for terrain. James was point man. The explosion had thrown Johnny nearly 30 feet. When he regained consciousness, the medic was already working feverishly on what remained of his leg. Through the haze of pain, he saw the medic sipping a body bag over James's face. 4 other men were wounded that day, but they all made it home alive because Johnny, despite his grievous injury, had remembered the precise extraction coordinates and, through heavy radio interference, had guided the medevac helicopter to their location. His navigation skills, the ones some dismissed as behind-the-lines work, had saved 5 lives that day. But he couldn't save James. So, each year, on the anniversary, Johnny sought out a restaurant. Sometimes he could afford a burger, sometimes just coffee. But he would sit, remember, and honor a promise only he was left to keep. The tattoo, the dagger piercing a compass, wasn't standard Marine insignia. It was something their small, highly specialized unit had designed, a personal emblem that only the 8 of them wore. Now, as far as Johnny knew, he might be the last one living who carried it. Just as Johnny finished his cold meal, the back door of the restaurant swung open. A military officer, in plain black civilian clothes, entered. He had a severe, no-nonsense buzz cut and walked with a decisive, purposeful gait. His name was Mike Cole. Mike was an elite navigation specialist with the Air Force Special Operations Command, home on leave for a few weeks. As he moved through the buzzing restaurant, his eyes casually swept over the patrons. That's when his gaze snagged on the old man by the window. Specifically, on the faded, unique tattoo clearly visible on Johnny's left wrist. Mike's stride faltered. He froze, eyes widening, his body going rigid. The casual murmur of the restaurant seemed to fade into a distant hum for him. Mike's eyes, fixed on the tattoo, narrowed slightly in disbelief, then snapped back to Johnny's face. He knew that mark. He'd seen it in classified historical files, in grainy photographs shown only to the most select new recruits. He took a deep, steadying breath, his military training kicking in, before striding purposefully towards the old man. "Excuse me, sir," Mike's voice was firm, yet tinged with an almost reverent tremor. "Were you with the Shadow Ops unit? Are you Dawson G6? Johnny, startled by the direct address, looked up, his eyes meeting Mike's. His voice was a raspy whisper, filled with a disbelief that matched Mike's own. "A long time ago, son. But yes, I was part of it." Without another word, in the middle of the suddenly quiet restaurant, Mike snapped to attention, executing a perfect, sharp military salute. "Sir," he declared, his voice ringing with undeniable respect, "you're the one they tell us about at training camp. You're a living legend." The buzzing restaurant, moments before filled with chatter and laughter, now fell into a stunned silence. Mike's commanding voice had cut through the casual atmosphere like a razor. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the gawking patrons, landing pointedly on the service counter. "This restaurant has no right to ask him to leave," Mike stated, his voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "If anyone feels uncomfortable in the presence of a living legend, perhaps they should step outside for some air." The four men at the nearby table, who had mocked Johnny moments earlier, flushed crimson. One of them, visibly flustered, mumbled an excuse and quickly stood up, making a hasty exit. An elderly woman, sitting alone at another table, slowly rose to her feet, her hand trembling as she began to applaud softly. Then, like a ripple spreading through a still pond, an entire row of other patrons began to stand as well, their applause growing in volume, a wave of belated respect washing over the room. Johnny, overwhelmed by the sudden, unexpected recognition, said nothing. But as Mike lowered his salute, Johnny gently reached out and squeezed the young officer's hand. His voice was barely audible, thick with emotion. "Thank you, son," he whispered. "Just one person recognizing, that's enough." But Mike wasn't finished. He stepped into the very center of the restaurant, his stance wide, his presence commanding. He spoke with a conviction that demanded attention, his voice ringing clearly through the now silent room. "This man, before you, John Dawson, in what was known as Operation Ghost, used his phenomenal navigation talents to guide the extraction of 17 wounded Special Forces operatives under extreme, hostile conditions. The tattoo he wears, this dagger piercing a compass, was earned in blood and sacrifice, not bought in a shop." His voice gained intensity. "I stand here today because men like him created the very standards we now follow. Men who sacrificed their bodies, their peace, their recognition, so that we might have ours." The restaurant remained utterly silent. Coffee cups, midway to lips, froze. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. All eyes were fixed on the young officer, his uniformless presence radiating authority, and on the old, frail man standing humbly by the door. "In training," Mike continued, his voice softer now, more pedagogical, "they teach us about the Shadow Ops teams, the men who made impossible missions possible through sheer genius and unwavering resolve. John Dawson designed extraction protocols that we still use today. His precise route planning saved more lives than most frontline medics ever could. He endured physical trauma and lifelong pain, yet he never sought a single medal or public recognition. He is the embodiment of silent service, a living testament to dedication. The restaurant manager, a portly man with a neatly trimmed beard, approached, his face pale and visibly shaken. "Sir," he stammered, addressing Johnny directly, "there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Your meal today is on the house, of course, and we would be honored if you would accept our invitation to return whenever you wish, as our esteemed guest." Johnny offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile and gently shook his head. "No need for special treatment," he said, his voice regaining a touch of its former quiet strength. "I just came to remember a friend." His words, devoid of bitterness, resonated deeply, highlighting the profound disparity between his simple, heartfelt intention and the casual cruelty he had endured. The manager, along with the four now silent men from the nearby table, hung their heads in shame. They had judged a book by its worn cover, dismissing a hero as a nuisance. The revelation of Johnny's true identity, amplified by Mike's passionate recounting, was a powerful moral and emotional hammer blow. It forced everyone in the room to confront their own biases, to reflect on the unseen sacrifices that underpin their daily freedoms, and to consider the true meaning of honor and respect. If you've ever misjudged someone based on their appearance, please comment with respect and share your thoughts. Let's remember those who give everything in silence. Mike softened his tone, a genuine smile touching his lips. "Sir," he asked gently, "may I join you? I would be truly honored to hear about your friend." Johnny nodded, a subtle warmth entering his eyes. "Please," he said, and together, they moved to a quiet table in the corner, not the desolate outdoor seating, but the best table in the house, cleared and set specially for them by the now apologetic staff. From across the room, the four middle-aged men who had laughed earlier watched in stunned silence. One by one, their faces etched with a mixture of shame and disbelief, they quietly stood up and left the restaurant, abandoning their half-eaten meals. The young waitress, Sarah Harrington, who had watched the entire exchange through the window, approached their table with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "I'm so incredibly sorry about earlier, sir," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather, he was in Vietnam too. He never talked about it." Johnny looked up at her, seeing something familiar in her eyes, a shared history in the quiet reverence she held. "What was his name?" he asked gently, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "James Harrington," she replied, her voice barely audible. "I never met him. He died before I was born." Johnny's hand, which had been resting on the table, trembled visibly as he reached for his worn wallet. With a deep breath, he pulled out a faded, creased photograph, its edges softened by time. He held it out to her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Your grandfather," he said softly, his voice catching slightly, "he promised to buy me a burger here someday. He swore we'd eat it together, the week after we got home." Sarah looked at the photo, her eyes widening as she saw a smiling, young James Harrington, standing proudly beside a young Johnny Dawson, both in uniform, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, with the faint outline of the New Hope Central restaurant in the background. A quiet, profound connection formed between the two, spanning generations and bridging the gap of unspoken sacrifice. The air around them seemed to shimmer with the weight of shared memory and newfound understanding. Days later, a small article appeared in the local town newspaper, tucked away on an inside page. It read, "The Old Soldier and the Salute That Silenced an Entire Restaurant." The accompanying photograph, capturing the powerful moment Mike Cole saluted John Dawson in the bustling restaurant, quickly spread across social media. It attracted millions of shares, comments, and heartfelt reactions, transforming a private moment of recognition into a public phenomenon. The community, stirred by the story, began to visit the New Hope Central restaurant, not just for the food, but to ask about Mr. Dawson. Many were genuinely surprised to learn he lived just 3 blocks away, a quiet fixture in their everyday landscape they had never truly seen. A group of local schoolchildren, inspired by the story, sent handwritten letters to Johnny's modest home, expressing their admiration and their desire to hear him tell stories, not about himself, but about those who had sacrificed, those whose names deserved to be remembered. Mike, after his leave, returned to his base, but he never forgot Johnny. Every month, without fail, a handwritten letter arrived at Johnny's doorstep, recounting Mike's latest training, his thoughts, and his unwavering respect for the veteran who had inspired him. The following spring, the town, spurred by the newfound awareness, organized a special ceremony honoring 12 of their most silent, unsung veterans. John Dawson was the first invited to speak. When he stepped onto the makeshift stage, his voice, though still soft, carried a new gravitas. "I don't represent anyone," he began, his gaze sweeping over the appreciative crowd. "I'm just someone who tried to do the right thing, and lived quietly." In the audience, Mike stood in the middle row, silent and unmoving, his hand placed respectfully over his heart. What began as a simple, unexpected moment of recognition transformed the entire town. Johnny's small map-making company, once a solitary enterprise, became an unexpected gathering place. Veterans from all walks of life would drop by, not just for his expert cartography advice, but for the quiet understanding they found there, a shared bond that needed no words. Johnny, in turn, offered free, expert map advice and guidance to any veteran who needed it. When local schools needed a speaker for Memorial Day ceremonies, Johnny would arrive quietly, never talking about himself, but about the profound meaning of service, the importance of remembering those who never returned, and the solemn duty to honor their sacrifice. The tattoo, that faded dagger piercing a compass, which had once drawn mocking whispers, became a revered symbol recognized throughout the community, replicated on a small bronze plaque placed reverently outside the town hall, bearing the simple yet powerful words, "Honor the quiet ones." Mike Cole's military career flourished, his dedication and exceptional navigation skills making him a rising star within the Air Force Special Operations Command. Yet, he never forgot his profound connection to John Dawson. During training sessions with new recruits, Mike would often share the story of the old navigation specialist, recounting how Johnny's intricate route planning had saved countless lives, emphasizing that true heroism often resides in the quiet, unsung acts. On John Dawson's 85th birthday, a surprise awaited him at his unassuming doorstep. Mike, now a seasoned instructor, stood there, not alone, but alongside 7 eager, young Air Force Special Operations navigators. They had traveled specifically to meet the man behind the legendary stories they'd heard in their training, the very architect of the protocols they now studied. But perhaps the most surprising guest of all was Sarah Harrington, the waitress from that day in the restaurant, who had brought her entire family, her parents, her younger siblings, and even her own infant child, to meet the man who had served alongside her grandfather. "He would have been so incredibly proud to know his granddaughter met you, Mr. Dawson," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, tears welling in her eyes. Johnny's voice was steady, despite the obvious emotion clouding his own eyes. "He would have been proud of you too, Sarah," he replied softly, a faint smile gracing his lips. He always talked about his family. The town, reflecting its profound shift in understanding and respect, decided to rename the street where John Dawson's map-making company stood. It was no longer just Elm Street, it became Silent Guidance Way. This renaming was not just for Johnny, but for all those whose quiet contributions unfolded behind the scenes, far from the spotlight, yet shaped the very fabric of their community and nation. 3 years later, John Dawson passed away peacefully. His funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the quiet impact he had made. Many wore small pins on their lapels, depicting the simple, yet profound, image of a dagger piercing a compass. His coffin was carried with full military honors, an acknowledgement that had been denied to him for decades. Mike Cole, now a decorated veteran himself, served as one of the pallbearers, alongside 5 other active-duty Air Force Special Operations personnel, their faces solemn, their steps precise. The old, worn cane that had supported him through years of silent service was gently laid beside him in the coffin, replaced by a gleaming new one provided by a veterans organization. This organization, deeply inspired by Johnny's story, had made it their mission to improve medical care and support for aging veterans across the country. And on his tombstone, beneath his name and dates, were etched a few simple, yet profound words that perfectly encapsulated a lifetime of quiet heroism. His silence spoke volumes. His guidance changed lives. If this moment made your heart stop, maybe it's time we stop forgetting those who gave everything in silence. Subscribe to TT Soul Stories for more veteran stories and touching narratives that still echo in our hearts. Comment with respect and share your thoughts.